September 19th, 1944. Near Ericourt, France. A Panther tank erupts in the fog, its turret torn from the hull and thrown into the mud like a broken toy. A second explodes, then a third. Flames tear across the field as steel giants that were supposed to be unstoppable burn like dry paper. 14 Panthers, the finest tanks Germany could build, lie shattered before the morning sun burns off the mist. American losses that day: almost nothing. The German commander had every advantage. His Panthers outgunned and out-armored anything the Americans could field. On paper, this was a massacre waiting to happen. Instead, it was his army that burned. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next thrilling video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past, and become part of a community that never stops learning from history. But here is the secret almost no one tells you. The man who helped crack the code of German armor was not a general. He was not a famous engineer. He was a quiet farm boy from New Jersey, a tank sergeant named Curtis Grubb Cullen Jr., a man who had never designed a weapon in his life. And the strange contraption he welded together in a muddy French field was called insane by the officers around him. By the time the war moved on, that crude invention would rip through German defenses across an entire front, save thousands of American lives, and help shatter an army that once believed it could never be beaten. This is the story of how an ordinary man did the impossible. It is the story of how a single stubborn idea, mocked and nearly thrown away, saved thousands of lives, and helped break the back of the most feared army in the world. But to understand why one sergeant mattered so much, we first have to go back to the moment America was humiliated, the moment German commanders looked at the United States Army and decided it was a joke. February 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. For the first time, green American troops slammed head-first into battle-hardened German armor, and what happened next was a disaster. Coordination collapsed. Commanders lost control of their units. Radios fell silent at the worst possible moments. Artillery fired late or never fired at all. Tank crews rolled forward alone with no infantry beside them and paid for it with their lives. Panzers appeared from the dust at angles the Americans never saw coming. Shells screamed in. Men bailed out of burning hulls with their uniforms on fire. It was chaos, and the enemy owned it completely. In just 2 days, the Americans were thrown back nearly 50 miles. Burning Shermans littered the desert. German commanders watched the retreat and reached a confident, sneering conclusion. The Americans, they decided, simply could not fight. They had no idea how wrong they would soon be. Because the real problem was never the courage of the American soldier. It was experience. The men were new. The officers were untested. The whole army was still learning a brutal trade the Germans had been perfecting for years. Every mistake at Kasserine cost blood, and the desert filled with the wreckage of that hard education. For months the pattern seemed to hold. German tanks were feared. Their crews were veterans. Their guns punched through Allied armor at ranges where the Americans could not even shoot back. The Panther and the mighty Tiger became legends monsters that soldiers whispered about around campfires. Something had to change, and it would. But not because of a wonder weapon rolling off a factory line. Not because of a bigger gun or thicker steel. It would change because of the men who refused to stop adapting, men who treated every disaster as a lesson and every defeat as data. The Germans built better tanks. The Americans built a better way of thinking. And everything was about to shift quietly because of a man almost no one had noticed: Curtis Grubb. Cullen Jr. was not the kind of man history usually remembers. He grew up ordinary, worked with his hands, and joined the army like millions of others. When the war swept him up, he became a sergeant in an American cavalry reconnaissance unit, part of the flood of armor pouring into France after D-Day. He was not loud. He was not famous. He did not crave medals or headlines. He was the kind of soldier who watched, listened, and thought while everyone else talked. Where others cursed a problem and walked away, Cullen quietly turned it over in his mind, looking for the crack in it, the weak seam where a solution might hide. And in the summer of 1944, the American Army had a problem that was killing men by the hundreds. It waited for them just past the beaches of Normandy in the green fields of France. It did not look like a weapon. It looked like peaceful farmland. But it was about to become a graveyard for American tanks and the young men who crewed them, and no general, no engineer, no manual had an answer for it. June 1944. The Allies had stormed ashore at Normandy and pushed inland expecting open country. Instead, they hit the bocage. These were hedgerows, but not the neat little bushes you might picture. These were ancient earthen walls, some over 6 feet high, packed solid with centuries of tangled roots and topped with thick brush. They had grown for generations, and their roots ran so deep and thick that they were less like plants and more like fortifications built by nature itself. They lined nearly every field in the region, turning the gentle green countryside into a deadly claustrophobic maze. For a defending German soldier, it was paradise. Every hedgerow was a ready-made fortress. Machine guns, anti-tank guns, and hidden infantry waited behind those walls, covering the narrow gaps between fields. American troops who pushed through those gaps were cut to pieces. And the tanks were helpless. When a Sherman tried to climb over a hedgerow, it reared up like a startled horse, its nose pointing at the sky and its thin belly armor completely exposed. In that instant, hanging on the crest of the wall, it was a sitting duck. German gunners waited for exactly that moment. One shot into the soft underside, and the Sherman was finished its crew with it. Losses climbed far beyond anything the planners had predicted. Some units were bleeding out their tanks faster than replacements could arrive. Officers stared at maps and saw an advance measured not in miles, but in single fields, each one paid for in men and machines. The great American offensive was grinding to a bloody halt in the hedgerows field by field, corpse by corpse. Generals demanded solutions. Engineers scratched their heads. And the men in the tanks kept dying. Then, in a muddy field, surrounded by frustrated soldiers, one sergeant said something that made the officers around him laugh. The debate among the tankers was endless. How do you beat the hedgerows? Someone half-joked that what they really needed was a giant pair of teeth to bite straight through the walls. Most men chuckled and moved on. Curtis Cullen did not laugh. He stopped, and he stared at that offhand joke like it was a doorway that everyone else had walked past without seeing. In his mind, the pieces were already sliding together. What if it was not a joke? What if you could bolt heavy steel blades onto the front of a tank low to the ground like the tusks of a charging bull? Instead of climbing the hedgerow and baring its belly, the tank would drive straight forward, ram the blades into the base of the wall, and tear right through it, keeping its armored nose facing the enemy the entire time. To many, the idea sounded ridiculous. Bolt scrap metal onto a battle tank and charge a wall of packed earth and roots. The tank would bog down. The blades would snap. The engine would strain and die. It was, some said, a waste of time and precious material dreamed up by a man who was not an engineer and had no business designing anything at all. A few laughed openly. Others simply shook their heads and walked away. Who was this sergeant to solve a problem that had stumped trained specialists? But Cullen had noticed something no one else bothered to look at. Scattered across the Normandy beaches were German obstacles, ugly steel structures the enemy had planted to stop landing craft. That steel was tough-angled and perfect. It was, in a strange way, a gift. The Germans had left the raw material for their own defeat lying on the sand. Cullen sketched his design. Heavy steel prongs cut from those beach obstacles welded into a set of tusks that could be fitted to the front of a Sherman. Crude, ugly, simple, and in the eyes of the doubters, absolutely insane. But Cullen was certain in a way, that no amount of laughter could shake. So he made his decision. He would build the thing himself, drag it into the field, and prove every last one of them wrong. Getting it done was not easy. There were no factories, no blueprints, no supply chain for a weapon that officially did not exist. Cullen and the men who believed in him had to scrounge for everything. They dragged twisted steel off the beaches under the eyes of skeptical officers. They begged for welding gear and burned through it in the mud. Not everyone was helpful. Plenty of officers thought it was a foolish distraction. Why waste precious steel and effort on one sergeant's wild guess? But word of the strange device spread, and soon the right people wanted to see it for themselves. The test came. A Sherman fitted with Cullen's steel tusks lined up in front of a thick Normandy hedgerow, one of the same monstrous walls that had been swallowing American tanks for weeks. Soldiers gathered to watch. Some expected a miracle. Most expected a joke. The engine roared. The driver let off the brake. The tank surged forward, engine screaming tracks, throwing mud, and slammed into the base of the wall at speed. For one heartbeat, everything hung in the balance. Nobody breathed. Would the blades snap like the skeptics promised? Would the tank ride up and bare its belly to the sky, the way every other Sherman always had? It did not ride up. The steel teeth bit deep into the earth and roots. Dirt exploded into the air. The whole wall split apart, and the Sherman punched clean through the hedgerow, nose down, armor forward, bursting out the other side ready to fire. The men watching erupted in cheers. It worked. It actually worked. The doubters fell silent. The joke had become a weapon, and this was only the beginning of what that one simple idea was about to unleash across the whole of France. Word traveled fast and it traveled high. Senior commanders desperate for anything to break the deadlock saw the device and instantly understood what it meant. This was not a curiosity. This was a key. General Omar Bradley himself saw a demonstration, understood exactly what he was looking at, and threw the full weight of his command behind it. The order went out at once. Build these cutters, and build them as fast as humanly possible on every tank that could carry one. American ingenuity kicked into overdrive. Welding teams worked around the clock, sparks flying deep into the night. Salvaged German steel, the very obstacles meant to stop the invasion, was hauled in by the ton and cut and shaped into hundreds of sets of tusks. It was poetic. The enemy's own defenses were being reforged into the tools of their defeat. The soldiers gave the modified tanks a fitting nickname. Because of the way they charged and gored through the walls, they called them rhinos. Within weeks, hundreds of Shermans across the front carried Cullen's invention on their hulls. And the effect on the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. The hedgerows, once impassable death traps, suddenly meant nothing. Tanks no longer crawled up and died. They smashed straight through, appearing where the Germans least expected them, guns already leveled and firing. For the German defenders, it was a nightmare. Their entire hedgerow strategy had been built on one simple fact, that American tanks could not get through the walls without exposing themselves. Now that fact was gone forever. The fortresses they had trusted were being torn open from every direction at once. Shermans that should have been climbing and dying were instead bursting through walls behind them, beside them, everywhere. The careful ambushes collapsed. The neat killing zones fell apart. Panic rippled through positions that had felt untouchable only days before. A problem that generals and engineers could not solve had been cracked by a farm boy sergeant with a welding torch and a stubborn idea. And the army had done something remarkable. It had listened to the man at the very bottom, taken his crude solution, and pushed it to the entire front in a matter of weeks. That speed, that hunger to learn and adapt, to take an idea from the lowest man in the ranks and hand it to an entire army in days, was quietly becoming America's true secret weapon. It was worth more than any Panther or Tiger the Germans could build. The hedgerows were breaking. The tanks were moving. For the first time since Normandy, the American advance had teeth, quite literally. Curtis Cullen, the quiet sergeant no one had noticed, had helped unlock the door to victory in the West. But cutting through hedgerows was one thing. Facing the full weight of German armor in open battle was another entirely. Because the enemy still had the Panther and the mighty Tiger monsters that could destroy a Sherman before it ever got close. The Germans still believed that in a real fight, tank against tank, they simply could not be beaten. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong, but not by a better tank, not by thicker armor or a bigger gun, by something far more dangerous, something they could not see coming and could not stop once it arrived. In Part 2, we will see how the American Army turned the Sherman's weaknesses into a lethal trap, how new techniques in the sky and on the radio began to destroy German reaction time itself, and how the stage was set for that terrible morning at Araucourt, when 14 Panthers would burn in the fog. The tank was never the real answer. What the Americans built around it was about to change armored warfare forever. Last time, a quiet sergeant named Curtis Cullen did what the generals could not. He bolted steel tusks onto a Sherman tank and tore straight through the Normandy hedgerows that had been slaughtering American armor field by field. The rhinos rolled. The advance had teeth again, and the German ambush walls fell apart. But breaking out of the hedgerows only pushed the Americans into open country. And in open country waited the one thing every tank crew feared most: the German Panther. It could kill a Sherman at 2,000 meters. A Sherman had to crawl to within 800 meters just to have a chance, and even then its shells often bounced off Panther armor like thrown pebbles. Think about that gap for a moment. 2,000 meters against 800. The Germans could see first fire first and kill first almost every single time. On paper, the Americans should have lost every open field duel in France. So how did 14 Panthers end up burning in the fog at Araucourt? The Americans never built a tank that could beat the Panther head-on gun for gun. They knew it. Their crews knew it. Every man who climbed into a Sherman knew the machine hunting him was better armed and better armored. The answer was not a better tank at all. It was a weapon most people never even think about when they picture armored warfare. And this is exactly where the story gets worse before it finally gets better. The weapon was artillery, but not artillery as the world understood it in 1944. For centuries, guns worked one way. A battery spotted a target, did its own math, and fired on its own. Each battery was an island. If you wanted more guns on one target, you had to tell each battery separately, and their shells arrived in a slow, ragged trickle, one group after another. The enemy heard the first rounds, dove for cover, and simply waited out the rest. A small group of American officers believed there was a better way. What if every gun for miles around could be aimed at a single target at the exact same instant? What if the shells from dozens of scattered batteries all arrived in the same terrible second, with no warning shot at all? They called the method time on target. The idea had grown quietly through the late 1930s inside a schoolhouse at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, home of the Field Artillery School. There, a handful of instructors built something new. They called it a Fire Direction Center, a room full of men with maps, slide rules, and telephones who could take a single request and instantly compute firing data for every gun within range. To the old guard, it was pure heresy. Picture the meeting. A young captain lays out the plan to a table of gray-haired colonels. Massed fire, he tells them, controlled from one center, every round landing together. An old artilleryman leans back and scoffs. "Guns fire by battery," he says. "They always have. And now you want one boy with a telephone to command 50 cannon he cannot even see?" "Yes, sir," the captain answers. "That is exactly what I want." The room laughs. It is madness, they say. Too complicated. Too fragile. One cut phone line and the whole delicate scheme collapses into chaos. Break the sacred link between a gunner and his own target, they insist, and you break the gun itself. Another officer shakes his head slowly. "You are asking men to fire at ground they will never lay eyes on," he says. "Blind. On the word of a stranger and a slide rule. No gunner worth his salt will trust that." The captain does not flinch. "With respect, sir," he replies, "the enemy does not care what my gunners can see. He only cares how fast and how hard the steel arrives. And nothing on this earth arrives faster or harder than every gun we own all at once." But the captain has numbers, and numbers do not laugh. Out in Normandy, American infantry was dying by the thousands against dug in German positions. Every hour of delay meant more telegrams sent to more mothers back home. The traditionalists were unmoved. They told the reformers to stop wasting everyone's time. Some were warned bluntly that their careers were finished if they kept pushing this nonsense. One was quietly threatened with a transfer to a desk far from any front, any gun, any chance at glory. For a moment, it looked like the idea would die in that room, buried under rank and habit and wounded pride. But the young captain had one card left to play, because he had found an unexpected ally, and that ally had stars on his shoulders. The ally was a senior officer who had watched the schoolhouse experiments years before and never forgotten them. He was not a romantic. He did not care whether the idea broke with tradition or bruised old egos. He asked only one question, the same question that would decide the whole war of ideas. Does it actually work? He gave the reformers the one thing they could not give themselves: cover, protection from the men who wanted them gone, and along with it, a single chance to prove the concept in front of the very officers who could kill it forever. The terms were brutal. One demonstration, one target. Several battalions of artillery would be spread across miles of open country, each with its own guns, its own crews, its own separate math. They would be handed a target and a time. Every shell from every battery had to strike within the same narrow handful of seconds. If the round straggled in one by one, if a single phone line failed, if the math was off by even a fraction, the skeptics would win, and the idea would be finished for good. So they prepared in secret. They coordinated the scattered batteries. They laid miles of telephone wire by hand across fields and ditches, splicing every break, testing every line twice. They drilled the fire direction center until the men could compute firing data half asleep, checking each other's math for the smallest error. They rehearsed the sequence again and again, every crew memorizing its exact role in the chain, every timing burned into memory. There would be no second attempt, no excuses, no do-over. If one man froze, one wire snapped, or one gun fired a heartbeat late, the whole thing would fall apart in front of the men who wanted it to fail. The day of the test arrived cold and gray, and if it failed, every man who had believed would be finished. They gathered on high ground overlooking a wide, empty stretch of ground, marked out as the target. The observers came in staff cars, the skeptical brass among them. Faces set hard binoculars already up. These were men who had spent 30 years learning that guns fire by battery, and they had come to watch a foolish theory embarrass itself. The guns themselves were nowhere in sight. That was the whole point. They sat hidden, scattered across the landscape in batteries. The observers could not even see some of them miles apart, connected only by thin strands of copper wire, and the men on the phones. Inside the fire direction center, the tension was a living thing. A target request came down. The men bent over their maps and instruments. This was the heart of the trick, and it was almost unnatural. Because to make every shell land at the same instant, the guns could not all fire at once. The batteries farther away had to fire first since their rounds flew longer. The closer guns had to wait firing later, so their shells caught up in the air. It meant firing in a strange, deliberately staggered order to create one unified strike. Every gun got its own precise data, its own moment to fire calculated down to the second. The clock ticked. A phone line crackled with static, and one operator's face went pale, then cleared as the connection held. The old colonels checked their watches and traded knowing looks. Any second now, they thought this circus would fall apart. The command went out down the wire. Far off, a lone battery barked. Then silence. The observers frowned, just as they suspected. A ragged, sputtering mess. Another distant gun fired. More silence. The nearby batteries, the ones they could almost sense in the folds of ground, stayed completely quiet. One colonel lowered his binoculars, the ghost of a satisfied smirk on his lips. It was failing, just as he had promised. Then the world ended. The entire target area erupted at once. Every gun that had waited in silence spoke in the same instant, and the shells that had already been flying arrived together with them. Not a trickle, not a wave. One single simultaneous convulsion of fire and earth and smoke across the whole grid, as if the ground itself had detonated in one heartbeat. Hundreds of shells launched seconds apart from batteries miles from each other, all slammed home in the same instant. There was no warning, No first round to dive away from. Nothing at all, and then everything all together. For a long moment, no one spoke. The observers stood frozen behind their binoculars, watching the smoke boil up off a piece of ground that no longer existed. When it finally cleared, the observers were silent. The smirk was gone. Several of the old officers had gone pale because they understood better than anyone exactly what they had just witnessed. They had seen the future of war. The numbers told the story no one could deny. Every gun of several battalions, dozens upon dozens of cannon, all delivered onto one point inside a window of just a few seconds. Under the old method, those same rounds would have dribbled onto the target over a full minute or more, giving any enemy plenty of time to scatter and survive. Now there was no time to scatter. There was no surviving. The old colonel who had scoffed lowered his glasses slowly. He had spent 3 decades in the artillery. "In 30 years," he said quietly, "I have never seen anything like that." The idea had won. But winning a demonstration on a quiet range was one thing. Turning it into a weapon across an entire army at war was something else entirely. The decision came fast. Push it out to every unit that could use it, and that unleashed a fresh avalanche of problems. Thousands of fire direction teams had to be trained. Radio and telephone nets had to be built and standardized so any observer could call fire and reach the whole system. Procedures had to be written, taught, and drilled into men who had fought a different way their whole lives. Resistance did not vanish overnight. Plenty of veteran units did not trust it. They had survived this long doing things the old way, and old ways die hard under fire. Why gamble their lives on a system built by men they had never met? So the believers went forward themselves, right up to the front lines, teaching crews between battles, sleeping in the mud, standing in the cold, and the shelling, to prove that one calm voice on a radio could pull the entire sky down onto the enemy's head. One demonstration in combat was worth 1,000 arguments back at headquarters. And then the first real combat results came in, and the arguments ended. A forward observer could now call for fire, and within about 3 minutes, bring the massed guns of an entire division, sometimes an entire corps, crashing down on a single point. Whole German formations were shattered before they could even deploy. During Operation Cobra in late July 1944, more than 3,300 tons of bombs tore open the German line, but it was the artillery that kept it open, answering every call in minutes, flattening every strong point that tried to reform. The Germans were baffled. Formations that massed for a counterattack simply vanished under fire that arrived from nowhere all at once. Their reaction time, the precious minutes their doctrine depended on, was gone. Then came September 1944, and a foggy field near Arcourt. Green German Panzer crews thrown into battle to counterattack. Patton's exposed flank rolled forward, confident in their mighty Panthers. What they did not know was that they were driving into a trap woven from everything the Americans had learned. Concealed M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, fast and deadly, waited in the mist. Pre-registered artillery grids covered every approach. The Panthers came on, and the Americans struck them from angles their thick frontal armor could not protect. 14 Panthers burned in a single engagement, then more. The Hellcats darted through the fog like wolves, striking from the flank and vanishing before the return fire came, while the artillery fell on the massed German tanks exactly as it had in the demonstration months before, all of it arriving at once, with no warning. Over the following weeks, German armor in that sector was systematically wiped out, the final kill ratio running roughly 3.6 to 1 in favor of the Americans. The finest tank in the world, the machine German crews had trusted their lives to, had been slaughtered wholesale by a system it could not see and could not outrun. Think about how far it had come. From a mocked theory scribbled in an Oklahoma schoolhouse, to a foolish idea nearly buried by angry colonels, to the deadliest artillery on the face of the earth. The Germans had lost the one edge their entire way of war was built upon, but they were not beaten yet, not even close. Because as autumn turned to winter, in the deepest secrecy, the German High Command was gathering everything it had left for one final desperate gamble. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks and guns, All of it aimed at a single weak, thinly held stretch of frozen forest that the Americans believed was perfectly safe. The weather would ground the plains. The snow would choke the roads and swallow the sound of engines, and every advantage the Americans had spent 18 months building would suddenly count for nothing in the freezing dark. The Germans were about to hit the American line exactly where it was weakest, at the worst possible moment in weather built for the attacker. Everything the reformers had built, the massed guns, the radios, the air power circling overhead, could be blinded in an instant by fog and falling snow. And the whole war in the West would hang on a handful of frozen crossroads towns, and the exhausted, outnumbered men who refused to leave them. The real fight was only just beginning. For 2 parts, we watched an underdog army rebuild itself. A sergeant's steel tusks ripped open the hedgerows. A mocked artillery idea became the deadliest guns on Earth. By late 1944, the Americans could answer any attack in minutes, and German armor was dying in droves. Then the Germans did something no one expected. They stopped trying to beat the American system in open battle. Instead, they built an entire offensive designed to blind it. December 1944. Nearly 500,000 German troops, around 1,400 tanks and assault guns. All of it hidden in the frozen Ardennes forest aimed at the thinnest, weakest stretch of the American line. And they chose their moment with cold precision. Thick fog, heavy snow, skies too gray for a single plane to fly. Every advantage America had spent 18 months building was about to be switched off in a single frozen morning. No planes, no clear artillery, no warning at all. And this time, it was not a test on a quiet range. It was raw survival, and the fate of the war in the West hung on it. The German plan was born from desperation, but it was ruthlessly clever. Their commanders had studied the same battlefields we have. They knew the truth by now. In a fair fight, they lost. American artillery arrived in minutes. American planes owned the sky. American units they thought destroyed were back at full strength within days. So they asked a different question. What if the fight was not fair? What if they could attack where the American machine could not function at all? They found their answer in the Ardennes. It was a quiet, lightly held sector considered too rugged for a major offensive. The American command treated it as a rest area, a place to blood green divisions and refit exhausted ones. Barely 4 divisions, many of them green or worn out, covered a front of over 80 miles. By the rules of war, that front should have been held by 3 times as many men. It was the softest, most tempting spot on the entire Western Front, and the Germans knew it. The Germans gathered in total secrecy. They moved at night. They banned radio traffic to defeat American eavesdropping. They muffled their tank engines and spread straw on the roads to hide the sound. They waited patiently for a stretch of foul weather that would ground every Allied aircraft. On December 16, 1944, it came. At dawn, the forest exploded. Nearly 2,000 German guns opened up along the front in a barrage that shook the frozen ground for miles. Then the tanks rolled forward through the fog, and the trees spearheaded by fearsome King Tiger tanks and hardened SS troops hitting stunned American units who never saw them coming. Whole companies were overrun in hours. Communication lines were cut. Command posts fell before anyone knew the enemy was near. In some places, green, exhausted American soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. It was the largest surprise attack the Americans had suffered in the entire war. The numbers were terrifying. The Germans punched a bulge more than 50 miles deep into the American line, the shape that gave the battle its name. In the first 3 days alone, thousands of Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. At one crossroads near Malmedy, German SS troops murdered more than 80 American prisoners in a snowy field, a massacre that would harden every soldier who heard of it. For the German High Command, the early reports were intoxicating. It was working. The impossible gamble was actually working. The Americans were reeling backward. The great combined arms machine that had chewed their armies to pieces all autumn had suddenly fallen silent. For the first time in months, German generals allowed themselves to believe they might just turn the entire war around. But this was not the only threat the Americans faced. The deadliest crisis was not out in the snow. It was the growing fear that their entire way of war had just been switched off, because everything the Americans had built depended on things the weather had just taken away. The artillery that answered in 3 minutes needed eyes. Forward observers had to see the target to call the fire. Now they saw nothing but fog and swirling snow. The Fire Direction Center sat ready and blind. The air power that shattered every German advance was grounded completely. Not one fighter bomber could fly through that soup. The sky, once a wall of death for German tanks, was empty, and the communications net, the nervous system of the whole army, was being sliced apart. German commandos in captured American uniforms, led by a daring commando officer named Otto Skorzeny, slipped behind the lines. They cut telephone wire. They switched road signs to send convoys the wrong way. They spread rumors and panic wherever they went. Suddenly, no American soldier knew who to trust at a checkpoint. Guards began quizzing every passing officer about baseball scores and hometown trivia, hunting for imposters, and the paranoia slowed everything to a crawl. At high command, the mood turned grim. Reports flooded in, contradictory and terrifying. Some officers wondered aloud if the offensive was a feint. Others feared the entire front was collapsing. Fingers began to point. How had they left the Ardennes so weak? How had they missed 500,000 men massing in the forest? For a few dark days, real doubt crept in. Had the whole American system been a fair weather illusion all along? Deadly. Only when the sun shone and the radios worked and the maps stayed clean, strip away the planes. Strip away the perfect coordination. Strip away the eyes in the sky. And were they just cold, frightened boys in the snow after all? Newspapers back home ran alarming headlines about a German breakthrough. Confidence that had been building for months wobbled in a single week. Some commanders quietly braced for a disaster that could undo everything. Then one town, one road junction changed everything. The town was Bastogne. On the map it looked like nothing. In reality, it was the key to the entire battle. Bastogne sat at the hub of 7 paved roads. In the mud and snow of the Ardennes, armor could not move cross-country. It needed roads. And nearly every road the Germans needed ran straight through Bastogne. Take it, and the offensive rolled on. Hold it, and the German timetable shattered. The Americans understood this instantly. They threw the 101st Airborne Division into the town by truck, racing the Germans to the crossroads. The paratroopers won by a hair. Then the Germans surrounded them, cut them off, and the siege began. The men inside were living a nightmare. The cold was savage, far below freezing. Frostbite took as many men as bullets. They were low on ammunition, low on food, low on medicine, with wounded stacking up in freezing cellars. They had almost no air cover. They were completely encircled, outnumbered, and outgunned. Every day the ring tightened. Every night the shelling came. And still they did not break. On December 22nd, a German officer approached under a white flag. He carried a formal demand for the Americans to surrender the town or be annihilated. The acting American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, read the ultimatum. His reply became legend. One word: nuts. The bewildered Germans had to have it explained to them. It meant no. It meant go to hell. It meant come and take it if you dare. When word of the reply spread through the freezing foxholes, exhausted men grinned for the first time in days. "If the old man says nuts," one paratrooper reportedly muttered, "then nuts it is." And the paratroopers of Bastogne held. They held through wave after wave. They held with frozen hands and empty magazines. They held because losing that town meant losing everything. But holding was not enough. To break the siege, help had to come, and it had to come fast. That help was already moving, and it was moving in a way that defied belief. 200 miles to the south, General George Patton had done the impossible. Told the Ardennes was in crisis, he pulled 3 divisions out of a battle they were already fighting, wheeled them 90 degrees to the north, and drove them through freezing storms toward Bastogne. He promised to attack in days. Staff officers said it could not be done. He did it in about 72 hours. At the tip of that spear was Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams and his tank battalion. His orders were simple and desperate. Punch through the German ring and reach the trapped men inside. The drive was hell. Snow, ice. German guns dug in on every ridge. Roads sheeted with black ice. His tanks pushed forward, yard by frozen yard. They bypassed strong points. They fought in the dark. They refused to stop. Men who had not slept in days kept rolling north toward the sound of the guns. Then, on December 23rd, the sky finally cleared. Everything changed in an instant. The fog lifted, the sun broke through, and the weapon the Germans had switched off came roaring back to life. Hundreds of Allied planes took off at once. Fighter bombers swarmed the German columns strung out along the narrow forest roads, columns that had nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. They hit the tanks. They hit the trucks. They hit the fuel convoys the Germans desperately needed to keep moving. Over Bastogne, transport planes thundered in low and dropped hundreds of tons of supplies to the men below. Ammunition, food, medicine, warm clothing. It rained down from the open sky like a gift from another world. The defenders looked up and cheered until their voices cracked. And the guns. The forward observers could see again. The 3-minute artillery came back with a vengeance, smashing every German attempt to storm the town. On the ground, Abrams closed in. His column fought through the last German positions tanks, firing on the move machine guns raking the tree line. The final push was a gamble in the fading light. He drove straight at the enemy ring, rather than around it, betting speed against odds. Late in the afternoon of December 26, 1944. His lead tanks smashed through the final German positions and rolled into Bastogne. The trapped and the rescuers met in the snow. Grimy hands clasped grimy hands. The siege was broken. The corridor was open. A trickle became a flood of relief pouring into the shattered town. For the Germans, it was catastrophe. Their whole offensive had been a race against the clock and the weather from the very first hour. The plan depended on speed on surprise and on capturing American fuel dumps before their own tanks ran dry. Now the clock had run out. The sky had betrayed them, and the fuel they had gambled everything on never came. Their most powerful spearheads, some within sight of their objectives, ground to a halt for want of a few gallons of gasoline. Tanks worth their weight in gold sat abandoned in the snow engines cold, while American fighter bombers picked them apart one by one. Crews torched their own vehicles and fled west on foot. The bulge had reached its limit, and now it began to collapse inward. The tide had turned, and once it turned with terrible speed. With Bastogne relieved and the skies clear, the full American machine came back online all at once. Air power, massed artillery, fresh armor, and a supply system that could rebuild a division overnight. The Germans, by contrast, had shot their bolt. They had committed their last great reserves in the West, and now those reserves were dying in the snow with no fuel and no air cover. The Americans and their allies squeezed the bulge from every side. Slowly, brutally, field by frozen field, they pushed the Germans back to the very line they had started from. There would be no breakthrough to the sea, no captured fuel depots, no splitting of the Allied armies in two. By late January 1945, after roughly 6 weeks of savage fighting, the salient was completely erased. The great offensive that was meant to change the war had achieved nothing but the destruction of Germany's last reserves in the West. The cost was staggering on both sides. It was the largest and bloodiest battle the United States Army fought in the entire war. Around 600,000 American soldiers were drawn into the fight. American casualties ran to roughly 75,000 men. But German losses were worse and far more decisive. Estimates run as high as 100,000 killed, wounded, and captured. They lost around 700 tanks and assault guns, along with hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft. Here is what mattered most. America could replace its losses. Germany could not. Every tank burned in the Ardennes was a tank that would never defend the homeland. Every veteran killed was gone forever, and the great fear had been answered. The American system was not a fair weather illusion. When the weather stole their planes and their eyes, the Americans did not collapse. They held the crossroads. They gutted it out in the snow. And the moment the sky opened, the machine they had built proved deadlier than ever. The system had survived its worst nightmare and won. The strategic verdict was final and merciless. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last real offensive of the entire war in the West. After it, there were no more reserves, no more surprises, no more gambles left to play. The initiative was gone forever. The road ran only one way now, east toward the Rhine, toward Berlin, toward the end that was suddenly rushing closer. From humiliation at Kasserine to victory in the frozen Ardennes, the transformation was complete. An army once dismissed as unable to fight had broken the back of the Wehrmacht. But step back from the maps and the casualty counts, and a quiet question remains. We have talked about generals and divisions and grand strategy. Yet this story began with a single sergeant and a crazy idea welded together in the mud. It ran through a young captain mocked by his own colonels. The war was won in large part by the nameless men who refused to accept that things could not be done differently. So what happened to them? What happened to Curtis Cullen? The quiet farm boy sergeant whose crude invention saved thousands of lives. What became of the reformers, whose mocked ideas reshaped modern warfare forever? Were they showered with medals and glory? Did history carve their names in stone, or did it quietly forget the men who mattered most? The battles are over, but the story has one final chapter, a chapter about legacy recognition and cost that very few people ever hear. We began with a crazy idea welded together in a muddy field. A sergeant's steel tusks tore open the hedgerows. A mocked artillery method became the deadliest guns on earth. And when the Germans gambled everything on one last winter offensive, the American war machine broke their back in the frozen Ardennes. From humiliation at Kasserine to total victory, an army once dismissed as unable to fight had transformed itself into something the finest German commanders learned to fear. But we ended the last part with a quiet question. What happened to the man behind the idea? What became of Curtis Cullen, the ordinary soldier whose invention helped save an army? The answer carries a twist that almost no one sees coming. Because this is not a simple story of a hero showered with glory. It is a story that is stranger, sadder, and in the end, far more meaningful than that. Because success, it turns out, often comes with a price, and the men who change history are rarely the ones who get to enjoy it. When the fighting in Normandy moved on, Curtis Cullen became briefly famous. His invention was demonstrated to nearly every senior commander in the theater. General Omar Bradley himself said it might revolutionize the war in that part of France. For his crude, brilliant device, the Army awarded Sergeant Cullen the Legion of Merit, one of the military's high honors given for exceptional service. A National Guardsman from Cranford, New Jersey, a man who had never designed anything, was now suddenly celebrated across the entire First Army. You might expect the story to end there with medals and a hero's welcome. It did not. Because the war was not finished with Curtis Cullen. Only about 4 months after his moment of triumph, he was fighting in the nightmarish Hurtgen Forest, one of the bloodiest and most miserable battles the American army ever endured. There, in the cold and the mud and the shattered trees, Cullen stepped on a German landmine. The blast cost him his leg. Think about that for a moment. Let it sink in. The man whose invention had carried thousands of tanks safely through the hedgerows, the man who had saved so many other soldiers from ambush and death, was himself gravely wounded and maimed in a forest. Few people today can even name. He was evacuated to England, then shuffled through a long series of hospitals back in the United States, learning to live without part of his own body. In September 1945, with the war finally over, he was quietly discharged. A decorated hero missing a leg, sent home to make his own way. He carried a Purple Heart, now alongside the Legion of Merit, the two medals telling his whole story at once. Genius and sacrifice. And what did this celebrated inventor do next? He did not become a general. He did not cash in his fame or ride it to fortune. He married a woman named Bernice in 1945, moved to New York City, and took a plain job as a traveling salesman. Day after day, he sold products for a living, walking on one good leg, and a prosthetic riding trains and knocking on doors, while almost no one around him had the faintest idea who he was or what he had done. The customer buying from the quiet salesman could never have guessed that this man had helped change the course of the largest war in human history. The years passed. His marriage ended in the early 1950s, and on a November day in 1963, Curtis Cullen died in Greenwich Village in New York City. He was only 48 years old. The man whose idea had helped crack open Nazi-occupied Europe slipped out of the world almost unnoticed, far from the battlefields, far from the fame. Here is the detail that breaks your heart. Just months after Cullen died, the most famous soldier of the age, former Supreme Commander, and President Dwight Eisenhower, sat down for a television interview on the 20th anniversary of D-Day. Standing in the very hedgerow country of France, Eisenhower told the whole nation the story of a young sergeant who had solved a problem that baffled an entire army. He wanted the world to remember Curtis Cullen. But Cullen was already gone. He never lived to hear the most powerful voice in the free world speak his name to millions. And yet his true legacy was never really about the medal on his chest, because what Cullen represented was something far bigger than one device on one tank. He was proof of an entire way of fighting a philosophy that would outlast the war by generations. The idea was simple but revolutionary. The men closest to the problem often see the answer first. An army that listens to its sergeants, its mechanics, its ordinary soldiers, and then acts on their ideas within weeks is far more dangerous than an army that waits for orders from the top. The Cullen Cutter was bolted onto roughly 3 out of every 5 American tanks in the First Army before the Great Breakout. That is not the story of one gadget. That is the story of a system that could take an idea from the bottom and spread it across a continent almost overnight. That same spirit ran through everything the Americans built. The responsive artillery, able to call down the guns of an entire division in about 3 minutes. The combined arms teams, where tanks, infantry, planes, and cannon all worked as one. The mechanics who could rebuild a broken tank in the mud, while German crews waited days for spare parts. This was the true American weapon, and it did not end in 1945. In the Korean War, American artillery again used massed coordinated fire that could blanket a target in seconds, breaking up massed human wave attacks that would have overrun a lesser army. In Vietnam, and in every conflict since the principle of the Fire Direction Center, one calm voice summoning the fire of many guns at once evolved into the digital fire control and networked targeting systems armies rely on today. The battlefield radio net that once tied a lone observer to a dozen distant batteries grew into the vast communication systems that now link entire fleets, air forces, and armies across the globe. The technology looks unrecognizable. The underlying idea is exactly the same one those mocked reformers proved on a cold demonstration range. And the humble idea of field improvisation never died either. Decades later in the deserts of Iraq, American soldiers welded scavenged scrap metal onto their vehicles to protect against roadside bombs, an act so familiar it was nicknamed with the same rough humor Cullen's crews once used. Combat engineers today still push purpose-built plows and blades ahead of their vehicles to clear obstacles and mines. The specific machine changes. The instinct, the willingness to improvise a solution from whatever lies at hand, is exactly what Cullen embodied on that Normandy beach. Across the entire war, this ecosystem of adaptation gave America a decisive edge. The country built more than 49,000 Sherman tanks, not because they were the best machine on the battlefield, but because they could be produced, repaired, and supported at a scale Germany could never match. At Eracourt, that whole philosophy came together and destroyed German armor at a kill ratio of nearly 4-to-1, even though the Panther was the superior tank on paper. The lesson was written in fire. The best equipment does not win wars. The best system does. As for Cullen himself, the Army did not forget the man entirely. A building was named in his honor at the Armor School at Fort Knox, where generations of tank crews would learn their trade. In his hometown of Cranford, New Jersey, a street bears his name, and a bronze memorial still stands outside the municipal building, so that the townspeople who pass it each day might remember the salesman who once helped save an army. Both Eisenhower and Bradley wrote about him in their memoirs, ensuring his story survived in ink even after it faded from the headlines. But the greatest lesson of all was never really about steel or artillery or engineering at all. It was about people and about the strange ways that great ideas are born and buried. The first lesson is the most hopeful one. A world-changing idea can come from anyone. Not from a laboratory, not from a general's tent. It came from a sergeant standing in the mud, a man with no engineering degree and no rank to speak of. History is full of such moments. The landing craft that carried troops onto every invasion beach were designed by Andrew Higgins, a boat builder from Louisiana, whom Eisenhower later called the man who won the war for the Allies. The specialized tanks that cleared the D-Day beaches, the swimming tanks, and mine flails, nicknamed the Funnies, were dreamed up by an eccentric British officer others had pushed aside. Again and again the breakthroughs came from the edges, not the center. The second lesson is a warning. Institutions resist new ideas almost by instinct. Cullen's solution was, in his commander's own words, absurdly simple. Yet it had baffled an entire army for more than 5 weeks while men died in the hedgerows. Why? Because armies, like companies and governments, are built to follow proven procedures, and a new idea threatens the comfort of the old way. The genius of the American army in that war was not that it had no resistance to change. It was that when it mattered, it managed to overcome that resistance faster than its enemy. The third lesson is about courage. It took nerve for a sergeant to push a strange idea up the chain of command, risking ridicule from officers far above him. It took nerve for the artillery reformers to stake their careers on a method the old guard called madness. Innovation is not just about having the idea. It is about the raw courage to champion it when everyone around you is laughing, and those lessons are not locked away in the past. Every organization on Earth today, every army, every company, every team faces the exact same choice that Cullen's superiors faced in the summer of 1944. Do you listen to the person closest to the problem, the one with dirt under their fingernails, or do you cling to the way things have always been done because it feels safe? The names and the machines change with the century. The choice never does. And the answer then and now still decides who wins and who loses. And there is one final detail buried in the record that almost no one knows. A detail that makes this story even more remarkable than it first appears. Because Curtis Cullen, the celebrated inventor, may not have been the true origin of the idea at all. According to the historian Max Hastings, the spark did not come from Cullen himself. During one of those endless, frustrated conversations among the tankers about how to beat the hedgerows, a soldier from Tennessee, remembered only by the name Roberts, spoke up with a rough suggestion. "Why not get some saw teeth," he said, "and put them on the front of the tank to cut through the hedges?" The other men laughed. It sounded ridiculous. Just another wisecrack from a frustrated GI. But Cullen did not laugh. He heard something in that offhand joke that no one else did. He took the throwaway idea seriously, turned it into a real design, welded together a working prototype, and pushed it up the chain until it reached General Bradley himself. And here is the part that tells you what kind of man Cullen was. He tried to give credit to Roberts. He was, by the accounts of those who knew the story, an honest man who did not want to claim glory that belonged to another. But it was too late. The publicity machine had already fastened onto Cullen's name. In the rush of headlines and medals, the soldier named Roberts simply vanished from history. We do not know his first name. We do not know what happened to him, whether he survived the war or where he is buried. The man who may have voiced the original spark was swallowed whole by the very story he helped create. It turns out the anonymous hero of this tale had an even more anonymous hero standing quietly behind him. And that perhaps is the most honest ending of all. Because it means the idea that helped win a war never truly belonged to any single man. It belonged to a conversation. It belonged to the countless ordinary soldiers who kept thinking, kept arguing, kept joking, and kept refusing to accept that a deadly problem simply could not be solved. Somewhere out there, a Tennessee soldier named Roberts made a joke that helped change the world, and then disappeared into history without a trace. His fate reminds us how many nameless people are woven into every story we think we know. So let us gather the whole journey into a few final breaths. From a National Guard sergeant with a joke and a welding torch to an army that answered every attack in minutes. From the ashes of Kasserine to the frozen triumph at Bastogne. Curtis Cullen and the nameless men like him proved a truth that outlived the war itself. That victory is not built from the finest tanks or the thickest armor, but from the courage to listen, to adapt, and to try the thing everyone else calls impossible. The Germans built a masterpiece on tracks and then ran out of fuel parts and men to run it. The Americans built something far more powerful. They built a machine that could learn. And because they did, tanks that should have been slaughtered instead broke the strongest army on earth, and thousands of young men came home who otherwise never would have. Curtis Cullen walked out of that terrible war on one leg, sold goods door to door, and died young and largely forgotten. But every time a soldier at the bottom dares to speak up, every time a great organization chooses the better idea over the older one, his spirit is still winning battles. And that is the true weapon that won the war. Not the steel, and not the size of the guns. It was the men who simply refused to stop thinking, and the system wise enough to listen to them. From a joke in the mud to the fall of the Third Reich, that single thread held. And that is a lesson worth remembering long after the last tank has rusted into the earth and the last soldier who fought in that war has gone.